Welcome. Tonight we're going to talk about something strange, sweet-smelling, slightly suspicious, and just a little bit deadly. This is the story of love potions. Yes, real ones. Recipes, ingredients, apothecaries, whispered instructions, sachets tucked into corsets, and more often than you'd think, poison. But this isn't about hearts and flowers. Because here's the truth. If someone in 15th century Italy was mixing herbs to make you fall in love, they might also be trying to kill you, or at least sedate you, or dull your judgment, or ensure you were just suggestible enough to say yes to something regrettable. So before you picture moonlight and roses, you should probably also imagine wormwood, belladonna, lead powder, and dried human blood. Comforting, right? Now, this journey is not urgent, it is soft and steady. As we begin, I invite you to relax, perhaps close your eyes, and allow the slow rhythm of history to guide you into rest. And if you enjoy these nighttime wanderings through forgotten chapters, consider liking and subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. Why it was dangerous to brew love potions. Imagine yourself walking through the narrow streets of Florence just as the sun has slipped below the terracotta rooftops. The air is cooling, the bustle has faded, and shadows stretch long across the cobblestones. A light breeze carries the scent of baked bread lingering from the bakeries, mixed now with wood smoke and the sharper tang of bitter herbs. Down one twisting alley, half hidden by a sagging archway, a crooked wooden sign creaks softly above a doorway. No inscription names the place, but those who know. This is the home of a speciale, an apothecary who dabbles in more than just stomach elixirs and salves. Inside this dim shop, jars line every wall, each marked in a spidery script. Some bear familiar names: rosemary, lavender, fennel. Others are stranger: mandragora, henbane, belladonna. The air is heavy here, not unpleasant, but thick with centuries of oils and powdered roots, beeswax and soot. Candles flicker low, their wicks smouldering over bowls of ground petals and dark syrups. This is where the work begins. Not in open view, but beneath the counter, or perhaps behind a curtain, where requests are made in murmurs, where eyes flick nervously to the door. To ask for a love potion is not a light request. It is not technically illegal, but it is unwise. The Church frowns upon any attempt to meddle with free will, and the Inquisition has a long memory. The line between natural remedy and witchcraft is thin and growing thinner as the 16th century presses on. Still, the need remains. Most requests come from women. Some are young and hopeful, perhaps infatuated with a merchant's son or a visiting noble. Others are older, wiser, perhaps married to men who no longer glance their way. A few come seeking to gain favor with someone far above their station, dangerous territory, and sometimes men come too, rarely and always alone, often looking over their shoulders. They ask in clipped tones, palms sweating. The ingredients used vary. Some recipes are simple, made from rosewater, cinnamon, and a touch of wine. Others grow more complex. A mixture might include the grated rind of a bitter orange, an infusion of aniseed and thyme, or crushed myrtle leaves. Myrtle, associated with Venus, the goddess of love, was a favorite. So was basil, believed to inflame passion. Honey was used to sweeten the taste and the mood. But then there are the darker ingredients. Mandrake root, shaped like a tiny human body, was said to scream when pulled from the earth. It was steeped in legend and believed to awaken desire or madness. Henbane brought on visions, but too much could stop a heart. Belladonna, literally beautiful lady, was used to dilate pupils and make the eyes more alluring, but also caused hallucinations and, in high doses, death. Some potions required personal items, a strand of hair, a bit of fabric, even a drop of blood. These were used to bind the drink to a specific person, to direct the power toward a single target. But the risk was great. If discovered, it could be seen as sorcery, and while Italy's courts rarely burned witches outright, punishments ranged from public penance to exile. Still, the apothecaries continued. Their shops served many roles. Officially, they were healers, mixers of balms and tonics, but in reality, they operated at the edge of legality, part physician, part therapist, part magician. They listened carefully to stories of unrequited love, of failing marriages, of secret liaisons and desperate plans. They measured not just by the spoonful, but by intuition, how much risk the client could handle, how deep their desire ran. The most skilled apothecaries knew how to walk the line. They used just enough potent herb to cause a flutter of the heart, a flush of the cheek, but not enough to kill. They advised caution. Add only 1 drop, they might say, no more than a sip. They warned of dreams, of dizziness, of unexpected emotion, and always they worked in silence. The walls of their shops heard many confessions, but spoke none. Their records, if kept at all, were written in codes or symbols. Ingredients were labeled with invented names. Recipes passed down orally, mother to daughter, master to apprentice. What remains today is fragmentary, mentions in court records, warnings in church sermons, and the rare surviving notebook. Yet even in those scraps, the world becomes vivid. You can picture the flick of a mortar and pestle, the steam rising from a boiling flask. You can hear the rustle of silk as a client departs, vial tucked safely in a pouch at her side. You can feel the quiet danger in the air, the sense that something secret has just transpired. Outside, the city sleeps, but in the apothecary's shop, the flame still flickers. Another potion cools in its jar, waiting to be delivered. And somewhere, not far away, someone lies awake, wondering whether the heart can truly be changed by the contents of a cup. The world of Renaissance love potions was not just mysterious, it was treacherous, and at the heart of that danger lay the plants themselves. To understand the true peril of these mixtures, one must first walk through a Renaissance herb garden, not the kind curated for beauty or flavor, but one designed for effect, subtle or otherwise. Imagine a small walled garden tucked behind a modest townhouse, perhaps in Bologna or Padua. The stone path winds through tidy beds where blossoms sway lazily in the sun. But the beauty is misleading. Here, among the familiar marigolds and violets, lie more menacing specimens, plants with velvety leaves and dusky purple blooms, roots twisted like limbs, berries that gleam like polished beads, irresistible to the eye and often fatal to the touch. There is belladonna, known as deadly nightshade. Its name means beautiful lady, owing to its use in dilating pupils, a fashionable enhancement believed to make the eyes more enchanting. Women would dab tiny drops into their eyes before a feast or court gathering, giving them a wide, luminous gaze. But the price was steep. Blurred vision, dry mouth, confusion, even madness. Taken internally, belladonna's alkaloids disrupted the nervous system, bringing on hallucinations, seizures, and ultimately death. Then there is henbane, a plant with a name that whispers caution. Its leaves give off a foul scent when crushed, and its effects were feared even in small doses. Yet it was used, in minute quantities, to lower inhibitions and induce vivid dreams. In love potions, it was sometimes added to trigger a sense of euphoria, though more often it led to nausea or disorientation. Apothecaries who employed henbane knew they walked a fine line. Too much, and the potion became poison. Another favourite, though equally deadly, was mandragora, mandrake. Its human-shaped root had inspired awe since ancient times, thought to house a spirit or to scream when uprooted. In Renaissance Europe, tales persisted that digging it from the ground would bring madness or death, and so rituals developed around its harvest, tying a dog to the plant to pull it free, covering one's ears, saying prayers. In practice, mandrake was prized for its sedative properties. Crushed and infused, it dulled pain and loosened the tongue. In a love potion, it made the drinker sleepy, suggestible. And yet, if the dose was wrong, it could silence the heart forever. These herbs were not used frivolously. Their inclusion in potions was deliberate, calculated. The apothecary, ever the careful chemist, would weigh and sift, steep and strain. But despite their knowledge, there was no standardization, no controlled dosages, no peer-reviewed trials. Every mixture was a guess, an attempt, a risk. Desperation often overrode caution. A young woman, perhaps recently married to a man chosen by her father, might seek to win his affection, to awaken something that had not stirred on its own. She might be advised to sprinkle a tonic into his wine, something with cinnamon and basil, safe enough. But if her friend suggested a stronger formula, one with a sliver of datura root or belladonna, she might be tempted. After all, the goal was noble: to secure her place, to preserve her dignity, to survive in a household not of her choosing. In other cases, the intent was darker. A rival lover, spurned and bitter, might wish to confuse or weaken the affections of her former partner. A scorned husband might attempt to regain control over a wandering wife. In these instances, the line between love and manipulation blurred, and the potion became a tool not of romance, but of dominance. Of course, many such efforts failed, or worse, backfired. There are scattered reports from the period of mysterious illnesses, sudden collapses, of men who fell ill after a banquet, of women who slipped into fevered delirium. Physicians of the time often blamed melancholia or imbalance of the humours, but in some whispered circles, people knew. They knew what had been attempted, what had gone wrong. Punishment for such acts varied by region and circumstance. In Venice, a woman caught with suspicious herbs might be brought before the Council of 10 for questioning. In Florence, the Dominican clergy might summon her for confession. Often, the accused denied everything. It was for a headache. I bought it for my sister. I never gave it to him. And sometimes that was true. Possession alone was not proof, but fear remained. Fear of social ruin, of imprisonment, of excommunication. Still, people returned to the apothecary. They kept seeking. The desire to be loved, to be chosen, desired, needed, was stronger than the warnings. And in a society that gave women so few tools of agency, a potion seemed to some like a quiet act of rebellion, not a poison, but a prayer in liquid form. The irony is that many love potions likely had no effect at all beyond the power of suggestion. A cup of warm wine with rose petals might simply taste sweet, but if the recipient believed it was enchanted, if they caught the glint in the giver's eye, if they felt the sudden rush of attention, they might respond. The true magic was psychological, not pharmacological. Still, the herbs were real, the risks were real, and so too were the desperate hearts that sought to distill affection into tinctures and powders, trusting in the fragile promise of chemistry and chance. As we move forward, we'll leave the garden of dangerous herbs behind. Our next path leads us to a tangled love story, one filled with beauty, betrayal, and shadows of scandal. It is the story of Lucrezia Borgia, whose name still stirs whispers of forbidden desire and political intrigue. As we continue this slow descent into the hidden world of Renaissance love potions, we must now turn our attention to the shadows that gathered around these practices, not just the risks of ingredients or the perils of incorrect dosages, but the looming specter of religious condemnation, public suspicion, and whispered accusations of witchcraft. To understand the climate of fear that surrounded the brewing of love potions, one must consider the powerful influence of the Church in early modern Europe. In the Renaissance, belief in magic was not only common, it was deeply embedded in the worldview of the time. The cosmos was seen as a complex hierarchy of powers, divine, celestial, and infernal, and many believed that earthly acts could tap into these invisible forces. A charm could protect a child from illness. A ritual could bring rain. A potion could bend the will of a heart. But in the eyes of the Church, any effort to manipulate free will, especially through unnatural or occult means, risked stepping into dangerous moral territory. The soul was sacred, and to interfere with it, even by attempting to influence another's emotions or affections, was to risk sin. Love potions occupied a peculiar position in this framework. On one hand, they could be seen as extensions of natural medicine, recipes handed down by midwives, rooted in folk knowledge, aimed at harmonizing the body and spirit. On the other hand, when used to alter desire, or worse, to deceive, they became suspect. Was the potion an innocent aid, or was it an instrument of control, coercion, even enslavement? This ambiguity is what made love potions so dangerous, not only in their composition, but in their perception. Imagine a young woman accused of ensnaring a nobleman's son. If she were beautiful and well-connected, the rumors might fade, but if she were poor, a servant, or a foreigner, the whispers could quickly escalate. She must have bewitched him, they would say. He would never choose her freely. And in such a claim lay the seeds of accusation. Witchcraft trials in Renaissance Italy were not as frequent or as deadly as those in Northern Europe, but they did occur, and love magic was a frequent theme in the charges. Court records reveal cases where women, often older, often widowed or unmarried, were accused of crafting powders, brewing teas, or reciting incantations meant to inspire love or lust. In one Venetian case, a woman was said to have sold small cakes baked with mandrake and hair clippings, promising they would win the heart of any man. When the potion failed, or perhaps when it succeeded too well, the client turned on her. She was brought before the magistrates, interrogated, and ultimately forced to confess. Her punishment was not death, but public humiliation, a ritual of penance before the church doors, barefoot and robed, holding a candle and reciting prayers. In another instance, a midwife in Milan was accused not only of dispensing love charms, but of invoking spirits during childbirth. Her client spoke of strange symbols, whispered words, and oils that smelled of sulfur. She denied the charges, insisting her remedies were natural, but the court was not convinced. She was imprisoned for several months and banned from practicing. It is important to remember that not all accusations were genuine. Many were fueled by jealousy, rivalry, or fear. A nobleman's sudden affection for a servant might embarrass his family. Easier to claim enchantment than admit impropriety. A failed romance might leave one party desperate for answers, and blame could fall on a witch. And for women living alone, outside the bounds of marriage or family, mere suspicion could be enough to provoke scrutiny. The line between herbalist and witch was perilously thin. Even the language used in love potion recipes, when written down, could be incriminating. Some surviving manuscripts from the period include phrases like to bind a heart, to inflame passion, or to cause dreaming. These were metaphors, perhaps, or poetic flourishes, but to the wrong reader, they could suggest something darker, a coded spell, an invocation. To avoid this risk, many apothecaries and midwives kept their knowledge oral. Instructions were memorized, not written. Ingredients were named in euphemisms: star's breath for lavender, Venus's tears for myrtle oil. Even among practitioners, discretion was paramount. A loose tongue could be fatal. And yet, despite all of this, love potions endured. They were whispered about in noble courts. They were passed quietly between friends. They were hidden in drawers, folded in letters, stirred into wine at candle-lit suppers. The same church that warned against them also tolerated their use, so long as it was discreet and did not disturb the social order. There was, in this contradiction, a kind of unspoken agreement. People needed love. They feared loneliness, longed for connection. And in a world where marriages were arranged, where courtship was constrained, where desire was often denied, potions offered a semblance of agency. They allowed people, especially women, to feel that they could shape their fate, even in small, secret ways, but they paid a price for that power. Suspicion, scrutiny, the ever-present threat of being named, of being watched, of being cast out not only from society, but from salvation. So the love potion remained what it had always been, a dangerous whisper in the dark, a blend of yearning and risk, a fragile hope carried in a vial. As we arrive at the final part of this chapter, we gently shift our focus from the ingredients and risks of love potions, from the watchful eye of the church and the fearful mutterings of witchcraft, toward something subtler but no less powerful, the intricate web of class, gender, and social reputation in Renaissance society. Love potions were not created or consumed in a vacuum. They lived within a rigid hierarchy of family expectations, of social norms, of gender roles that shaped every interaction, every decision, and every silent longing. In a time when status defined nearly all avenues of life, even something as seemingly personal as desire had to play by the rules of rank and reputation. Imagine for a moment a noblewoman in her mid-20s, already older than many brides of her class, living in a villa on the outskirts of Padua. Her marriage has been delayed by war or perhaps by her family's debts. Suitors have dwindled, and though she wears fine clothing and speaks with elegance, her future feels uncertain. In this world, love is a luxury few can afford, but admiration, longing, these are dangerous, quiet flames. She may visit an apothecary under the pretense of treating sleeplessness or nerves, but in truth, she seeks something more potent, a blend of marjoram, rose petals, and orange blossom, meant to make her cheeks flush when she speaks, to embolden her words. The potion is not for another, it is for herself, a tincture of confidence, a hope that she might be seen, heard, chosen. Now picture a laundress, poor, unmarried, perhaps widowed, working for a family in Venice. Her hands are chapped, her back aches from hours bent over buckets, but she has caught the eye of a journeyman mason, and he has not yet proposed. She scrapes together coins to purchase a sachet of herbs, basil, thyme, and powdered clove. It is said to bring dreams of the one you desire, and if shared between two people, to deepen affection. The noblewoman and the laundress have little in common by status, but their hopes rhyme. Both are women with little control over their futures. both turn to the same whispering tradition, but only one is likely to be punished for it. In Renaissance society, class served as both shield and snare. Wealth and noble lineage could insulate a woman from scrutiny, but they also imposed stricter codes of behavior. A scandal could ruin a family name, a misplaced letter, an overheard rumor, a vial found in a drawer. Any of these might be enough to unravel a betrothal, to prompt a brother or father to act. Control over a noble woman's heart was not hers to hold. For women of lower classes, the opposite was true. They often moved through society with greater anonymity but far less protection. A servant dismissed for suspicion of enchantment might find herself blacklisted from other households. A washerwoman accused of seducing a married man might be publicly shamed, even beaten, and in court the testimony of a poor woman carried little weight against that of a wealthy accuser. Men, too, played their roles in this tangled game. Some used potions to stoke desire, to coax affection from reluctant partners. Others accused women of using potions as a way to discredit them, to explain away unwanted feelings. A nobleman caught in an affair might claim to have been bewitched, an excuse that, while implausible, often saved his reputation at the expense of his lovers. There were cases where men sought out apothecaries to influence business rivals or sway political allies through charm and persuasion. While not strictly love potions, these mixtures drew from the same lore: herbs for eloquence, oils for likability, perfumes to subtly alter the air in a room. In every instance, the line between persuasion and manipulation blurred. Even among women, potions could be a source of quiet competition. In some circles, noble women traded recipes as part of courtly flirtation, discussing ingredients not just for health, but for allure. These exchanges were laced with caution, with feigned disinterest. A friend once tried this, one might say. It made her very memorable. The other would nod, understanding the code. These quiet rituals, stirring powders into tea, placing scented sachets beneath a pillow, anointing wrists with oils, were deeply personal, but they were also public acts in disguise. Every perfume worn, every gesture made, was seen, interpreted, judged. Reputation in the Renaissance was not a private thing. It was a communal mirror, held up and polished daily. And love, in this world, was never just love. It was politics. It was currency. It was a question of lineage and alliance, of what could be gained and what might be lost. To fall in love outside one's station was to risk ruin. To be loved by someone above one's place was a gamble, one that rarely ended well. A potion might tilt the scales briefly, but it could not rewrite the rules. Still, people tried. They brewed, they hoped, they risked. Not always out of desire, sometimes out of desperation. A second daughter with no dowry, a widow with children, a maidservant who dreamed of a life beyond servitude. Love potions became symbols of possibility, fragile, fleeting, dangerous possibility. And in that way they tell us more than just the story of herbs and mixtures. They tell us what people wanted, what they feared, what they were willing to risk to be chosen, to be cherished, even for a little while. As we close this chapter, let us return to the quiet hum of that apothecary's room, the jars on the shelves, the worn wooden counter, the flickering light. Somewhere, a hand reaches for a vial, a heart beats a little faster, a choice is made. And across the centuries, that quiet choice, hope in the form of a potion, still echoes. Chapter 2. The Forbidden Love of Lucrezia Borgia. Picture a grand hallway echoing with soft footsteps, lined with marble busts and frescoed ceilings, candles casting golden flickers across polished stone. In the distance, a bell tolls the hour over the city of Rome, and in one of the chambers behind these heavy doors, a girl sits still, her fingers tangled in the folds of her silk gown. She is not yet 15. Her name is Lucrezia. Born in 1480 to Vanozza de Catane and Rodrigo Borgia, better known to history as Pope Alexander VI, Lucrezia entered the world already marked by scandal and significance. She was the daughter of a man whose ambition would reshape the papacy and whose name would become synonymous with corruption, cunning, and control. And from the moment she could walk, Lucrezia's life was never truly her own. The Renaissance elite did not see daughters as burdens, nor as purely sentimental figures within the household. They were pawns, delicate and refined, but strategic. Lucrezia was no exception. Her education, by all accounts, was exceptional. She was trained in Latin, poetry, music, needlework, and etiquette. She learned to move with grace, to speak with poise, and to listen always more than she spoke. These were the tools of her future role, not as a woman in power, but as a woman whose presence could shift the balance of it. By the age of 13, Lucrezia had already been engaged twice, first to a Spanish nobleman, then to a member of Milanese aristocracy. Both arrangements were broken off when better opportunities appeared. Eventually, she was married to Giovanni Sforza, a man many years her senior and head of a powerful northern family. The union was less about love and more about political positioning, but the marriage was not to last. Only 2 years after the wedding, her father, the Pope, decided that the Sforza alliance no longer served his needs. Rumors swirled, political tensions rose, and suddenly the Pope was seeking an annulment on the grounds that the marriage had never been consummated. This was a public humiliation, particularly for Giovanni Sforza. To be declared impotent by papal decree was not just insulting, it was dangerous. In retaliation, he began to spread whispers that the real reason for the annulment was not his lack of virility, but Lucrezia's closeness with her brother, Cesare Borgia. The rumors grew. Even today, Lucrezia's name is shadowed by them. Incest, poisonings, seductions. They say she carried a hollow ring laced with venom. They say she lured men to their doom at lavish banquets. They say she was both victim and architect of the Borgia family's darker dealings. But what do we actually know? The historical record is more subtle and more tragic. There is little evidence that Lucrezia was anything other than a tool in the machinations of her family. She was moved like a chess piece from marriage to marriage, her fate tied not to her own desires, but to the shifting political landscape of Italy. After Sforza, she was married again, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, a young and handsome Prince of Naples. This union seemed at first to offer some happiness. There are records of tenderness, letters that suggest affection. Lucrezia may have genuinely loved him, but again politics intervened. Her brother Cesare, now aligned with France, viewed the Neapolitan connection as a liability. Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica and later died from his wounds under mysterious circumstances. The Vatican murmured condolences. The public suspected otherwise. Lucrezia, now widowed before 20, was once again a pawn. And yet, amid all this turbulence, Lucrezia began to change. She was not merely passive. While her early years had been defined by obedience, her later years reveal a woman of intellect and resilience. As Duchess of Ferrara, her third and final marriage, she came into her own. There she presided over a refined court, supported poets and artists, and raised children with care. She cultivated peace where there had been strife. The rumors followed her, of course, but the reality was something softer, steadier. Still, the forbidden love story lingers. Was there truly affection between Lucrezia and Cesare? Their correspondence is formal but close, They were raised together, relied on one another, and in some accounts shared a bond that unsettled observers. Yet historians debate whether these were true signs of scandal, or merely the projection of a world eager to see sin in power, especially in a woman. The love stories that surround Lucrezia, both real and imagined, reveal something about the Renaissance mind. In a world of arranged marriages, secret affairs, and carefully calibrated alliances, love itself became suspicious. If a woman seemed too fond of a man, especially a brother or a father, there must be more to the story. If she smiled too often, wore too much perfume, laughed too freely, it could not be innocence. It had to be intrigue. So Lucrezia became a symbol of the dangers of beauty, of the peril of influence, of the fear men held toward women they could not control. Yet behind the myth was a woman, married 3 times, widowed once, mother to 8 children, and bearer of burdens not of her making. She wrote letters, received poets, grieved losses. Her story is not just one of forbidden love, but of endurance. As this segment closes, imagine her standing on a balcony in Ferrara, overlooking the gardens at dusk. The air is warm. Somewhere below, music rises from a lute. She is not a witch, or a seductress, or a pawn. She is simply Lucrezia, a woman of her time, misunderstood, misused, and perhaps quietly defiant. Let us return now to the grand palaces of the Borgia dynasty, places where the line between celebration and scheme was vanishingly thin. Picture a banquet hall aglow with torchlight, the scent of roasted meats and warm bread hanging heavy in the air. Tapestries ripple softly in the evening breeze caught between open archways. The silver gleams, laughter echoes, glasses clink, and somewhere amid the revelry, beneath the perfumed stillness, a cup waits, perhaps a little darker than the rest. This is the scene that has haunted Lucrezia Borgia's legacy more than any other, the poisoned wedding feast. It is important to say at the outset, much of what we believe about Lucrezia, especially about the poisonings attributed to her and her family, comes to us through rumor and politically motivated slander. The Borgia name had many enemies, and the Renaissance was a time when character assassination was often more efficient than its literal counterpart. That said, feasting and poisoning were deeply linked in the cultural imagination of the time. A banquet was more than a meal. It was a public display of wealth, of alliances, of hierarchy. Every course served had meaning. Every seat at the table was a political placement. To host a feast was to declare your strength. To be invited was to be acknowledged. To eat was, symbolically, to submit to the host's authority. And to poison a guest, well, that was to invert everything the banquet stood for. The rumors surrounding Lucrezia often place her at the center of such stories. One tale insists that she possessed a hollow ring crafted with a hidden chamber that could be filled with a slow-acting toxin, enough to slip into a rival's drink with a casual flick of the wrist. Other accounts describe special goblets used by the Borgias, some set aside for friends, others for enemies. And always, it seems, there was a sense of performance, a death disguised as digestion, a crime cloaked in civility. But what was actually in these poisons? Contemporary accounts suggest a number of ingredients. Cantarella was the most infamous. Its exact makeup is still debated, but it was thought to contain arsenic, powdered opium, and perhaps the ground remains of toxic plants like aconite or hellebore. It might be colorless and tasteless, or it might be masked by strong wine or a spiced stew. In some versions, it was administered slowly, over days or weeks, disguised as medicine. The association between Lucrezia and Cantarella is likely exaggerated, but there were deaths that raised questions, high-profile ones, ambassadors, rivals, noblemen. some who fell ill after sharing a meal or visiting the Vatican's inner circle. The pattern was enough to seed doubt, and in the absence of proof, myth took root. Lucrezia's role in these events, if any, is still unclear. By the time these rumors were spreading, Lucrezia had already been transferred again from husband to husband, from Rome to Ferrara. Her movements were not always of her own choosing. She did not preside over feasts with full agency, yet she was present often in ceremonial roles, greeting guests, bestowing gifts, arranging seating. It is entirely possible that the legends of poison grew not because she administered it, but because she existed so gracefully in a world that many found threatening. A beautiful, educated woman bearing the Borgia name, married 3 times, and trusted by both church and court. That alone was enough to make her suspect. Still, the banquet persists in imagination. Imagine now a particular wedding feast, perhaps her own, perhaps one arranged by her brother. The tables are set with gold-embossed chargers. The courses are endless: peacock pie, sugared almonds, gilded fruit. Musicians play softly in the background, and somewhere between the courses of pomegranate glaze and honeyed quail, a guest begins to perspire. Their voice falters, a servant appears, a chair is discreetly pulled back. No one says a word, because to speak would be to admit suspicion, and to admit suspicion is to name an enemy. Better, in many cases, to allow the moment to pass. Later, perhaps, it would be called indigestion, or heat stroke, or divine punishment. In this way, poisoning remained the perfect crime of the elite, uncertain, undetectable, and deniable. And women, trained in herbs and accustomed to secrecy, were frequently accused of mastering the craft. Lucrezia, as a figure, embodied the contradictions of her time. She was both daughter and wife, Borgia and outsider, protector and suspect. If she ever did administer poison, she left no trail. If she did not, she was nevertheless accused of wielding invisible power, something equally threatening in a patriarchal world. Banquets themselves faded as the Renaissance wore on, replaced by more discreet forms of political alliance. But the poisoned feast lived on, in pamphlets, in paintings, in operas. Lucrezia was portrayed again and again as a silent enchantress, lifting a goblet to smiling lips while plotting some elegant death. The truth, as always, is more ambiguous. Perhaps she merely watched. Perhaps she smiled and made polite conversation as someone else slipped something into a cup. Or perhaps she knew only what others whispered later, when the guests had gone and the night had grown still. Imagine her, once again, alone in her chamber after a feast, pulling pins from her hair. The sounds of laughter and clinking glasses have faded. The candles have burned low. She removes a bracelet, a slipper. She sits in the quiet and perhaps thinks not of poison or politics, but of something far simpler. Of a moment during the banquet when a lute played her favorite melody, or when a guest complimented her gown, or when her son smiled at her from across the room. That, too, was part of her life. The myth of the poisoned banquet may forever surround Lucrezia Borgia, but within it is a real woman, complicated, quiet, watching, and sometimes that is where the deepest truths reside. In the stillness of late evening, long after the torches have been extinguished and the corridors have emptied of their whispering courtiers, imagine Lucrezia seated at a carved writing desk. A single candle flickers beside her, its light dancing across a stack of fine parchment and a slender vial of ink. The world outside her window is silent, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant creak of iron gates. Within this hush, she writes. Letters were among Lucrezia's most powerful tools. In a time when physical presence was constrained, when a woman's movements were closely observed and her voice often disregarded. Writing allowed expression, persuasion, secrecy, and connection. Her surviving correspondence reveals a woman articulate, affectionate, and often melancholy, capable of deep emotion and strategic thought alike. We must remember, letter writing in the Renaissance was both an art and a necessity. For nobility, it served as the lifeblood of diplomacy, romance, and family. Couriers carried folded secrets between city-states, and codes, ciphers, and symbolic language were often used to obscure meaning. For Lucrezia, letters may have been the safest way to share her inner world. Many of her surviving letters are to her father, Pope Alexander VI, and her brother Cesare. They are dutiful, warm, respectful, but also hint at manipulation or the performance of loyalty. In one, she expresses concern for Cesare's health in such affectionate terms that later historians speculated on an inappropriate closeness. There is no definitive evidence of incest, yet the very tenderness of her tone fed the rumor mills of her enemies. Even the simple phrase, "I long for your return," was weaponized. More revealing, perhaps, are her letters to Alfonso of Aragon, her second husband. Their union was one of her few that may have involved genuine affection. Alfonso was young, handsome, and charming. The two shared a brief, tender marriage. Brief because Cesare had him murdered in 1500. Before that tragedy, Lucrezia's letters to Alfonso were soft, even playful. She wrote of missing him terribly, of praying for his safety, of dreaming of their reunion. She addressed him with nicknames, expressed longing in poetic phrases, and spoke of shared hopes for the future. For a woman so often described by history as cold or calculating, these letters show a very different figure, one who loved and who feared the fragility of that love. After Alfonso's assassination, carried out with chilling precision in Rome, Lucrezia was shattered. Reports from the time describe her as inconsolable, retreating into isolation, refusing food. Whether this was an act or a sincere expression of grief, it left an impression. She wore mourning garments for weeks and reportedly kept his portrait near her until her own death. Yet the world did not stop for heartbreak. Soon after, she was married again, this time to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, another political match and one that would finally provide her with a more stable position. In Ferrara, Lucrezia became duchess, and her correspondence grew more complex. She exchanged letters not only with her husband, children, and family in Rome, but also with poets, scholars, and diplomats. Her writing revealed an adeptness at courtly language, an ability to navigate shifting political winds, and always the undercurrent of emotion. One of the most remarkable aspects of her writing is its duality. She could write as a mother, concerned about her son's health, and in the next paragraph shift into subtle negotiation with a bishop. She might express warmth in a letter to her father, and in the same breath hint at dissatisfaction with the church's expectations of her. She could be coy, persuasive, even flirtatious when needed, yet also commanding and clear when circumstances required it. These letters, over time, formed a kind of private counter-history. They show a woman who was not the passive pawn described by some, nor the femme fatale painted by others. Instead, she was a Renaissance woman in the fullest sense, educated, literate, multilingual, able to wield influence through the quiet power of ink and paper. Still, many of her letters are lost. Historians believe that after her death in 1519, some of her personal papers were destroyed, perhaps by loyal servants, perhaps by cautious family members who feared what her words might reveal, perhaps even by Lucrezia herself. The Renaissance was a time when reputation was currency, and a misplaced letter could undo a lifetime's work. And so we are left with fragments, pieces of correspondence preserved in archives, tucked within court records, or quoted second-hand in other documents. They are not always dramatic. Some discuss a delivery of silk or the care of a child. Some mention a feast or a visit from a cardinal. But taken together, they form the rhythm of her daily life, the unglamorous, persistent act of living and adapting and communicating. It is easy to forget that so much of a person's life, especially a historical figure like Lucrezia, is lived in these quiet moments, not in scandal or spectacle, but in the deliberate choice of a word, the pause between lines, the seal pressed carefully onto wax. Imagine again that room. Lucrezia sits in a chamber scented faintly with violet oil. The window is ajar, letting in the soft rustle of trees. A quill scratches gently on parchment. Her gown whispers as she shifts. Perhaps she hesitates before writing a name. Perhaps she blots the ink with a practiced hand. Perhaps she rereads the letter, wondering how it will be received. Then she folds it, seals it, and hands it to a waiting servant. What she wrote may be lost to time, but the act itself remains. The act of choosing words, of sending part of herself into the uncertain world beyond her door. And in that, we find something lasting, a voice, however faint, still echoing through the long corridors of history. By the time Lucrezia Borgia had settled into her role as Duchess of Ferrara, the chaos of her earlier years had faded into a kind of cultivated quiet. The scandals of Rome, the swift marriages, whispered affairs, and brutal murders lay behind her like a distant storm cloud slowly dissipating over the hills. What remained was a life of routine, decorum, and influence, and gardens. In the early 16th century, the gardens of Ferrara were among the most beautiful in Italy. They were not wild or untamed, but carefully ordered, laid out in geometric patterns inspired by both classical ideals and the evolving aesthetic of the Renaissance. Hedges were clipped with precision, fountains murmured into marble basins, and fragrant herbs mingled with fruit trees and flowering vines. It was in these carefully tended spaces that Lucrezia often walked, sometimes alone, sometimes in quiet conversation with a trusted lady-in-waiting or a visiting scholar. The gardens offered a sanctuary, both literal and metaphorical, from the rigidity of court life. They were private enough to breathe freely and open enough to remind her of her place at the heart of a noble court. Imagine her there, moving slowly along a gravel path, the morning sunlight dappling her gown. She might pause to brush a hand along the leaves of a rosemary bush or stoop to admire a cluster of violets. The air smells of damp earth and citrus blossoms. Bees hum faintly in the distance. In these quiet walks, Lucrezia was not a pawn nor a villain. She was simply a woman seeking calm in a world that rarely afforded her peace. As Duchess, Lucrezia's duties were vast. She oversaw household operations, patronized artists and musicians, and engaged in the management of estates. Her marriage to Alfonso d'Este had begun as a political arrangement, but gradually settled into something resembling partnership. He was a practical man, concerned with fortifications and governance. She, more attuned to the subtleties of courtly life, complemented his directness with grace and diplomacy. Lucrezia also found herself drawn to intellectual and artistic pursuits. The Ferrarese court, under her influence, became a center of culture. She hosted poets such as Ludovico Ariosto, whose epic Orlando Furioso was shaped in part by the environment she nurtured. She supported musicians and theologians alike, offering patronage and thoughtful correspondence. Her court was refined, but not extravagant, elegant, but not ostentatious. The gardens reflected this balance. Their design incorporated not only plants but symbols of love, loyalty, virtue, and restraint. Paths often formed mazes, echoing the emotional labyrinths of courtship and politics. Statues of Venus, Diana, and other classical figures reminded visitors of the ideals and dangers of passion. It is likely that Lucrezia, versed in such iconography, saw these images not merely as decoration, but as quiet commentary. Here, in the stillness of Ferrara's green spaces, love took on new forms, no longer the desperate longing of youth or the dangerous thrill of forbidden attraction, but a softer, steadier force. She wrote letters to Alfonso when he traveled. She arranged marriages for her children with care and strategy. She engaged in conversations about literature and beauty, all while managing the practical needs of the duchy. Yet even in this chapter of her life, shadows lingered. She suffered multiple pregnancies, many ending in stillbirth or infant death. She bore at least 8 children, of whom only a few survived. These losses, while common in the period, were nonetheless deeply personal. Court records speak of periods when Lucrezia retreated from public life, likely due to grief or illness. Some describe her as melancholic, others as serene. Perhaps she was both. Illness followed her increasingly in later years. Some blamed complications from childbirth. Others speculated about emotional strain. Regardless, by the time she reached her late 30s, her health was fragile. Still, she remained active in court affairs, fulfilling her role with quiet resilience. Toward the end of her life, her religious devotion deepened. She commissioned chapels, supported convents, and spent more time in private prayer. This was not unusual for a woman of her station, but it also reflected a shift from the survival instincts of her Roman youth to a more contemplative engagement with mortality. Her letters from this period become more introspective, though always measured. Lucrezia Borgia died in 1519, shortly after the birth of her last child, who also did not survive. She was 39 years old. Her body was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini in Ferrara, where her tomb can still be visited today, a simple stone marked by a name once feared and adored in equal measure. It is a quiet resting place, no grand monument, no towering sculpture, just a name, and the echoes of a life lived in contradiction, scandal and virtue, power and vulnerability, manipulation and grace. As you picture her walking once more through the gardens, think not of the gossip-laden tales whispered in Roman corridors, but of a woman who endured, who adapted, who found a kind of peace, even if fleeting, in the rhythm of flowers blooming and leaves falling, in the simplicity of a sunlit bench, a well-tended vine, and the long shadows cast at twilight. For all her complexity, Lucrezia Borgia remains elusive, but in the soft rustle of her gown among the rosemary and rose hips, in the measured pace of her steps along the garden path, we may find something honest, something human, and that, in its own way, is a kind of truth. Chapter 3. Secrets of the Venice Love Manuals. Imagine yourself in Venice during the height of the Renaissance, where the very air seems heavy with the scent of salt and ink. Gondolas drift soundlessly beneath stone bridges. Candles flicker in windows above twisting alleyways. And behind closed shutters, secrets are being exchanged, not shouted or sung, but written, scribbled in careful looping hands, hidden in drawers, handed off with a nod and a glance. In this strange and whispering city, love manuals were born, not the grand epics or the courtly romances of medieval Europe. These were slim, clandestine works, passed quietly among the educated and the curious. bound not in leather but often in soft cloth, their pages filled not with sweeping declarations but instructions, precise, peculiar, and always private. The Venice love manuals were unlike anything else of the time. They weren't concerned with virtue or chastity. They did not moralize or sermonize. Instead, they offered recipes, advice, aphorisms, allegories, and above all, curiosity. If the formal world of the Renaissance celebrated reason and restraint, these little volumes catered to desire and fascination. Picture a young nobleman in his chamber, the water of the canal lapping softly below his floorboards. He lights a candle, draws the curtain, and from beneath a stack of merchant records, he retrieves a delicate manuscript. On its first page, a hand-painted border frames a single phrase, "For the heart that waits and the hand that dares." The manual might begin with a short poem, something about a rose in winter, a metaphor for hidden longing, and then, without transition, a list to soften the voice. Chew leaves of wild thyme. To win affection, steep rose petals in honey and write your name with the mixture beneath the tongue. To be remembered in dreams, sleep with a pinch of vervain beneath your pillow. There were countless versions. Some claimed Greek origins, others hinted at Egyptian secrets. A few disguised their purpose with Latin titles or religious iconography, but their true purpose was never entirely hidden. The readers knew, the writers knew. Even the censors, when they occasionally caught wind of them, seemed unsure how to proceed. These manuals weren't obscene, not quite, but they weren't innocent either. Venice, with its tolerance for ambiguity, was the perfect place for them. The city thrived on double meanings. A merchant's ledger might also be a code. A prayer book might contain political satire, and a love manual might teach far more than affection. In one popular version, a passage described the ideal hour for declaring desire, just after the ringing of the 6th bell, when the city was quiet but not yet asleep. It advised the reader to wear linen washed in rosewater, to approach slowly, to speak softly, and to offer, if possible, a small token, a pressed flower, a ribbon, a poem committed to memory. Another manual included a list of gestures, where the eyes should rest, how the fingers should move, what it meant to touch one's sleeve versus one's collar. It was a silent language, designed for salons and masked gatherings, a language built on subtleties and restraint. And yet, for all their quiet elegance, the manuals could be startlingly direct. Some included instructions for preparing simple aphrodisiacs, infusions of cinnamon and nutmeg, powders of ground date pits, wine warmed with basil and figs. These recipes were often framed as medical remedies, but the intention was clear. Pleasure was not just tolerated, it was studied. The authors of these manuals remain largely unknown. A few signed their initials. Some claimed to be scholars or monks. Others wrote under classical pseudonyms. One, calling himself the Shadow of Ovid, insisted that all his knowledge came from dreams. Collectors guarded their copies fiercely. Pages were recopied by hand. Errors crept in, new verses were added, and slowly the manuscripts evolved. No two versions were quite the same. What survives today are fragments, bits of parchment tucked into larger volumes, marginal notes scribbled alongside religious texts, a faded page catalogued under miscellaneous alchemical writings. Yet even in these fragments, a certain tone endures, not lustful, not romantic, but wondering, as if love were a strange map, and these manuals merely traced its faintest contours. The Venice love manuals did not promise success. They did not claim to conquer the heart, but they acknowledged, in their quiet way, that longing is a kind of wisdom, that to study desire is to study being itself. And so, in the stillness of those candle-lit rooms, readers turn the pages slowly, not to race to the end, but to savor the questions. The next segment will explore a particular manual in depth, its recipes, its structure, and the strange beliefs behind its words. Now, let us turn the pages of a particular love manual, one whispered about in letters, referenced obliquely in diaries, and once seized by a Venetian censor only to mysteriously vanish from the record weeks later. It was known by a curious title, Il Codice dell'Inclinazione, or the Codex of Inclination. Not a book in the formal sense, but rather a stitched-together booklet of loosely arranged writings likely passed from hand to hand among the aristocracy, poets, and apothecaries of the early 16th century. Imagine the manual before you now. The parchment is uneven, the ink faded in places, but still legible. Its edges are frayed from fingertips that turned its pages with both reverence and secrecy. There is no table of contents, no author's name, just a symbol on the front, an Ouroboros, the serpent eating its tail, and a single sentence below, per quelli che osano sentire, for those who dare to feel. The first section begins not with words, but a simple illustration. A heart split in two, one side flowering with vines and blossoms, the other coiled with thorns and smoke. Beneath it, a note in fine cursive, desire is both medicine and poison. The dose is yours to measure. From there, the manual reads like a combination of herbalist's diary, mystic's journal, and personal confession. There are lists, always lists, of substances believed to alter the balance of affection and attraction. Powdered violet root for modesty, crushed fennel seed for courage in speech, tincture of saffron and mint taken with warm milk at dawn to stir confidence before a meeting, dried petals of peony sewn into the lining of a coat to guard against heartbreak. Each entry is annotated with signs, astrological symbols, phases of the moon, or vague warnings such as only beneath the waning crescent or never to be mixed with rosemary when spoken truths are near. The recipes were deliberately imprecise. Measurements were given in poetic terms. A thimble of twilight, the weight of a sigh, enough to scent a glove. This ambiguity gave the manual its air of enchantment, but also made its use a matter of intuition. It was less a guide than an invitation to observe oneself, to notice the turning of moods, the flush of the skin, the rhythm of conversation. One section, titled Sulla lingua mute, on silent tongues, offered methods of non-verbal courtship, instructions on how to adjust one's pace while walking beside someone, how to fold a letter so its sender's intent was clear before the first word was read, how to leave a pressed flower in a book as a sign, and which bloom to choose depending on the sentiment, rosemary for remembrance, marjoram for desire, lavender for longing tempered by restraint. And then there was the chapter called Gli occhi persi, the lost eyes. It offered no recipes or aphorisms, only a series of brief vignettes, fictional lovers whose glances never met, whose affections passed like ships in mist. It served perhaps as a quiet warning. Not every desire finds harbour, not every potion stirs the intended heart. The tone of the manuscript was never overtly romantic. It did not sing of love as salvation. Instead, it portrayed affection as a craft, something to be studied, refined, perhaps even manipulated, but never entirely controlled. There was humility in its pages, a recognition that to love was also to risk misunderstanding, disappointment, and loss. What is most remarkable is that Il Codice dell'Inclinazione rarely advised direct confession. In a culture where open declarations could lead to scandal or ruin, subtlety was elevated to an art form. The Codex taught patience, how to wait without vanishing, how to gesture without revealing, how to sense the tremble of opportunity without grasping too tightly. Some historians argue the manual was written not by a man but a circle of women, educated, secluded, perhaps tied to one of the island convents that often doubled as informal salons for noble women. The delicacy of the writing, the focus on interior experience, and the tactile nature of the rituals suggest a feminine hand, but like the potion recipes themselves, the authorship remains a mystery, and maybe that is part of the spell. When one reads the fragments of this codex today, there is a haunting familiarity in its contents. The language has shifted, the beliefs have changed, but the questions remain. How do we signal affection without speaking it? How do we preserve our dignity while reaching for connection? And can the heart be stirred by something as simple as the scent of basil on a silk sleeve? The Codex offered no guarantees, but it left behind something just as precious, the quiet permission to try. Let us continue by examining the interplay between these manuals and the underground world of erotic alchemy, where the boundaries between science, desire, and superstition grew deliciously thin. Now we turn to the strange middle ground, that elusive space where old science touched the edge of magic and both conspired with desire. In the Renaissance, particularly in a city like Venice, alchemy was not confined to dusty laboratories and bubbling vials of gold-tinted mercury. It was not only about transmuting lead into gold or seeking the philosopher's stone. Alchemy was also a language, a way of describing transformation, and within that language, love was among the most powerful catalysts. Erotic alchemy, a term we use now, though the practitioners of the time might not have dared name it so plainly, formed a quiet undercurrent beneath the respectable currents of medical and mystical inquiry. And within the pages of certain love manuals, the influence of this tradition was unmistakable. Imagine a narrow study room overlooking the Grand Canal, a tiled floor still cool from the night, a small fire crackling in a hearth no larger than a suitcase. The table is cluttered, not with books alone, but with small glass jars, bundles of dried herbs, and twisted iron tools, and seated at the table, someone who is neither entirely doctor nor entirely mystic, but something in between, a compiler of secrets, a weaver of elements. The manuscripts tied to erotic alchemy were more obscure than their poetic counterparts. Where some manuals read like charming etiquette guides for the lovesick, these texts were dense, coded, and steeped in metaphor. Their recipes were not accompanied by tender phrases, but diagrams of the human body as a vessel, of planetary correspondences, of arcane geometries mapping the intersection of touch, time, and temperament. One surviving example, catalogued under the vague title Liber Corpus et Spiritus, contains a lengthy section titled De Calore Humido, on moist heat. To the modern reader, this might prompt a raised eyebrow, but in the humoral theory of the time, this phrase referred quite seriously to the bodily state most conducive to attraction, pleasure, and vitality. The author, anonymous but clearly well-read, outlines mixtures meant to awaken the blood, to stir the melancholic into motion, or to temper excesses of cold humor. One such mixture involves grinding cloves, cinnamon bark, and dried orange peel into a paste, then combining it with a few drops of distilled rose water and smearing the result on the wrists and behind the ears before speaking to a potential beloved. The scent, the author claims, aligns the blood to the desire of the other. Other recipes are more curious still. A cloth infused with marjoram oil, hidden in one's shoe, said to make the bearer more graceful in movement. Wine left to sit beneath a fig tree during a full moon, intended to calm nerves and enhance the tone of one's voice. Powdered amber mixed with honey and rubbed into the palms before writing a letter, with the belief that it lent the words a kind of sweetness that could be felt by the reader. While these rituals may seem quaint now, they were based on a sincere, if not entirely scientific, understanding of how the body and soul were interlinked. The alchemical principle of as above, so below was taken seriously. Planetary alignments affected moods, bodily fluids mirrored elemental balances, and desire itself could be coaxed or cooled with the right combination of materials and timing. Even the tools used in preparing these mixtures were thought to influence their potency. Wooden mortars rather than metal, water drawn from certain wells, vessels sealed with wax embossed with specific sigils. It was not just about the ingredients, but the intention, the rhythm of the preparation, the atmosphere in which the potion was made. There was a spiritual dimension to all of this as well. In some manuals, the process of preparing a love elixir is described as a kind of devotional act, not worship of a god exactly, but reverence for the mystery of attraction itself, an acknowledgement that to desire and to wish to be desired was a form of vulnerability deserving of care. One Venetian text links each stage of potion making to phases of courtship. The gathering of ingredients parallels observation, noticing the beloved. The grinding and mixing represent conversation and bonding. The final infusion and storage are likened to confession, or the moment of offering. This metaphor turns the alchemical act into a narrative, a symbolic rehearsal of love itself. Critics of the time, particularly more devout clergymen, accuse these practices of heresy, or at the very least, superstition. Some manuals were burned, others were hidden behind false backs in cabinets. But the knowledge never quite disappeared. It moved underground, it changed hands, it was whispered, copied, disguised. And Venice, a city of masks and mirrors, gave such knowledge the space to survive. It is important to remember that those who practiced erotic alchemy were not necessarily charlatans or seducers. Many were genuinely seeking to understand the mysteries of human connection, to make sense of the way a touch could linger in memory, why a scent could stir longing, how timing, intention, and symbol might deepen intimacy. They may have failed in the end to bottle love, but in their efforts they left behind a record of yearning that feels oddly timeless. The final segment of this chapter will examine how the love manuals influenced and were influenced by the social rituals of the elite, salons, masquerades, and the coded theatre of courtship among the noble families of Venice. As we drift into the final segment of this chapter, imagine the flickering light of a dozen chandeliers reflecting off polished marble and brocade-covered walls. Imagine the soft rustle of silk skirts, the faint clink of glass, and the murmur of conversation spoken half behind fans, half behind masks. This is not the study of a solitary herbalist, nor the hidden room of a scribbling scholar. This is a Venetian salon, part performance, part negotiation, part game. In the noble courts and salons of Renaissance Venice, courtship was not just private, nor was it merely romantic. It was public, strategic, and often performative. Every gesture, every word, every glance held multiple meanings. And here, in these rooms draped with velvet and perfumed with orange blossom water, the influence of the love manuals found its most theatrical expression. Masquerade balls were particularly fertile ground for this coded language. Disguise was not simply for fun, it allowed the upper classes to speak more freely, to flirt without consequence, to reveal without revealing. Behind a painted mask, a noble woman might recite a line she'd read earlier that week in a love manual, something suggestive, something slightly out of place, and wait to see if her partner recognized it. The manuals often provided instructions specifically for such events. One popular version included a section titled, "For the Ball, Motions and Meanings," which listed common fan movements and their interpretations. Holding the fan near the lips, I wish to speak privately. Flicking it closed, my interest wanes. Holding it open while turning away, follow me. These gestures became a kind of silent dialogue, and those who mastered it were seen as especially refined or dangerously cunning. It wasn't just gestures either. The choice of perfume was strategic. A manuscript from 1587 advised mixing iris root with crushed violet for a scent that inspired curiosity and melancholy, ideal for encounters intended to linger in the mind. Another suggested musk infused with myrrh for confidence and warmth, said to create a sense of familiarity even among strangers. Even the colors of one's clothing held meaning. Deep green was associated with fidelity, gold with admiration, pale blue with longing unfulfilled. These codes were not universally known, but among certain social circles they were carefully studied, often through the very manuals that had circulated for decades. More than just a source of seduction, these guides were used to train daughters in the art of influence and sons in the subtleties of diplomacy. Because love in the salons of Venice was rarely just about hearts, it was often about alliances, dowries, favor, power. And so, young noblewomen would rehearse not only music and poetry, but how to pass a note discreetly, how to make an exit that left just enough unanswered, how to answer a compliment without accepting it. A lesson in ambiguity. One surviving letter between two sisters, both daughters of a Venetian merchant family, details how one of them successfully captured the attention of a viscount by quoting from the fourth line of the Mirror of Affection during a masquerade. She wrote with restrained excitement. He finished the verse without hesitation and asked me where I had read it. I told him it was taught to me by a ghost, which he said was the best lie he'd heard all night. There was a kind of joy in this subterfuge, a delight in the rules, and in breaking them just enough. These salons were not places of wild abandon. They were spaces of choreography, where pleasure and performance walked hand in hand. Some salons hosted readings of the love manuals aloud, framed as intellectual amusements. Pages would be recited in soft tones, punctuated by laughter, sighs, or thoughtful silence. One gentleman, a noted collector of such texts, hosted a private evening during which each guest was asked to read their favorite aphorism from their own love manual, but to do so while wearing a mask and using a false accent. The evening blurred performance and authenticity, flirtation and reflection. It is within this atmosphere, refined, restrained, and endlessly suggestive, that the Venice love manuals truly lived. They weren't just books, they were tools for crafting persona, for testing attraction, for performing intelligence and wit. To read them was not simply to learn how to love, but how to move through the spaces where love was negotiated. As the candles burned low and the final notes of the evening's music faded into the water-laced air, guests would slip back into the anonymity of their gondolas, their costumes damp with sea mist, their minds spinning with the possibilities opened by a single shared glance, a whispered line, a familiar perfume. In the next chapter, we'll leave the salons and turn inward into the dressing chambers of noblewomen, to explore the private rituals of beauty, preparation, and charm, and the secrets kept behind lace curtains and locked cabinets. Chapter 4. Inside a noble woman's dressing chamber. Imagine it is just before dawn in a noble household in Florence. The air is still cool, heavy with the scent of lavender tucked into the bedding. A faint light is just beginning to glow along the edge of the shutters, filtered through layers of gauze and carved wood. You are lying beneath a coverlet of fine wool, embroidered with delicate vines and tiny stars. The city is not yet awake. The canal beyond the villa wall is still, but inside the rhythms of the day are beginning. Before a noble woman opens her eyes, the quiet choreography of her attendants has already begun. A maid has stirred the coals in the brazier to take the chill from the marble floors. Water, drawn from the courtyard well, is being gently warmed in a copper basin. Linen towels have been aired and folded, perfumed subtly with rose oil. Her dressing chamber, a small private room adjoining the bedchamber, is being prepared for the ritual of the morning. This is no hurried routine. For a woman of status, even the act of rising is a performance. It is quiet, deliberate, and steeped in custom, not merely for vanity, but for control, over appearance, over health, over the day itself. When the noble woman enters her dressing chamber, she is greeted by silence and scent. There may be a single candle still lit from the night before, its flame flickering gently in a dish of brass. Her maid might be kneeling at a small table, mixing a paste of powdered almond and water to cleanse the face. Another is laying out the day's undergarments, a soft chemise freshly laundered, with lace threaded by hand at the cuffs and collar. A small mirror rests atop a painted chest, edged in silver and polished until it gleams like water. Such mirrors were precious and rare. They did not show the self as we know it now, clear and sharp, but rather as a shifting, dappled version. A reminder, perhaps, that beauty in the Renaissance was always slightly obscured, always softened by interpretation. The noble woman sits. A comb, carved from horn or ivory, is warmed slightly by the fire and passed slowly through her hair. Each stroke is unhurried, part care and part meditation. Hair, in many cultures of the time, was believed to carry health, strength, and even moral character. To groom it was not just to tidy, but to affirm one's place as wife, daughter, matron, or maiden. Once the hair is arranged, perhaps braided into a crown or pulled back into a net threaded with pearls, the skin is tended. A poultice of crushed fennel and milk might be applied to lighten freckles. A lotion of beeswax and olive oil might be used to soften the hands. There is no rush. The rhythm of this room is different from the world beyond. It moves not by clocks, but by habit and hush. On a small shelf near the window are vials and bottles, carefully labeled, often in Latin. Some are imported from far-off cities: orange flower water from Seville, myrtle balm from Rome, rose tincture from Constantinople. Each carries not just a scent, but a story, a memory, a promise. There are boxes too, small, carved and locked. Inside, slips of parchment bearing verses, copied from love manuals perhaps, or pressed flowers from a masked ball, a coin given during a secret conversation, a thread from a lover's cuff. These keepsakes are tucked away, not meant for display, but for quiet recollection. As she dresses, the noble woman is not just adorning herself, she is assembling an identity. Today's gown might be dove-grey silk, embroidered at the hem with gold thread, or a deep plum velvet, reserved for days of receiving guests. Jewelry is chosen not only for colour but for implication. a ruby for vitality, a pearl for modesty, a cameo bearing the likeness of a Roman goddess, perhaps to inspire a certain aura. And always there are charms, a silver pendant shaped like a heart, a tiny pouch sewn into the bodice filled with rosemary and lavender, a ring inscribed with a motto known only to the wearer. These are not mere trinkets. In a world where fate seemed ever at play in matters of health, politics, and love, such tokens offered a quiet kind of armor. The final moments in the dressing chamber are reserved for contemplation, a glance in the mirror, a whispered prayer, a pause to inhale the fragrance of the day's perfume, perhaps neroli and clove. The noble woman breathes deeply, then stands, gathering her skirts with practiced grace. She is ready to emerge. The ritual is complete, but the day has only just begun. Step again into the quiet of the dressing chamber, a place that hums not with sound, but with intention. In this space time slows. Every object is placed deliberately, every gesture practiced and refined over years. And among the most potent elements of this ritual space are two things that linger long after the doors close behind her: perfume and powder. Imagine yourself seated on a carved stool beside the noblewoman's small preparation table. Its surface is worn smooth with use. There are no sharp lines here, only soft corners, edges that have seen 1,000 mornings. On the tabletop, spread like the tools of a miniature alchemist, lie small vessels of clay, glass, and tin, some sealed with wax, others stoppered with cork. A few open to the air, releasing subtle wisps of scent, a breath of orange peel, a hint of rosemary, a grounding note of earth and smoke. In the Renaissance, perfume was not simply a cosmetic luxury. It was a signal, a form of self-writing. A scent could declare one's intentions, one's status, even one's mood. And for a woman in a society where words were often weighed and watched, fragrance became its own kind of language, spoken not aloud but through air and memory. Perfume began with oil, olive, almond, sometimes walnut, gently warmed and infused over many hours, sometimes days, with herbs and flowers. The preparation was part science, part meditation. Dried petals were ground between stone, twigs snapped and stirred into slow, simmering pots. There was no rush. The longer the infusion, the more potent the effect, and each blend had its own quiet code. Rose and sandalwood might suggest grace and modesty. Basil and myrrh, quiet confidence. Clove and orange peel, a spark of daring. To scent oneself with jasmine before an evening gathering was to whisper a secret, not to the room, but to the air itself. Some noble women kept written records of their favorite combinations, pages stained with oil, edges browned by candle flame. These were not shared lightly. A recipe was as intimate as a diary entry. To borrow another's blend was a delicate request, one made only between sisters, or the dearest of confidants. Just as important as the oils were the powders. Laid out beside the vials were small cloth packets, tied with string or ribbon. Inside crushed pearls, rice flour, or chalk. These were dusted lightly on the skin, not to disguise it, but to soften, to reflect candlelight, to calm the sheen of summer heat. Often these powders were scented too, with dried rosebuds, or with violet root scraped to dust. The application was unhurried, a puff to the cheek, a sweep across the collarbone, a fine cloud around the shoulders which settled invisibly but transformed the way one moved, slowly, deliberately, aware of the wake left behind. For the noblewoman, this was not mere vanity. The scents and powders she chose shaped the way the world encountered her. They marked her presence in a room before she spoke. They lingered on fabric, on letters, even on the hands of those who touched her gloves in parting. Some days the perfume was chosen to soothe, lavender and verbena for a quiet morning. On others, to protect, a drop of angelica root behind the ear believed to ward off illness. And on nights of longing or ceremony, a bolder choice, musk, ambergris, civet, rich and earthy, carried all the way from distant coasts. Not all fragrances were imported, of course. Many noble women maintained small still rooms, domestic laboratories tucked into back corners of the home. Here, alongside their attendants, they might press herbs into oil, distill flower water, or dry petals on linen screens. This was not simply craft work, but a kind of stewardship over the self and over the subtle instruments of influence. Because in the complex theatre of Renaissance society, a woman's influence could rarely be declared. It had to be worn, suggested, scented, a trail of neroli on the hem of a gown, a wisp of cedar in her wake, a sachet hidden in a lover's cloak. Even the containers themselves held meaning. A perfume bottle from Venice cut with colored glass was a marker of wealth. A simple clay vial from a local apothecary hinted at restraint, and an engraved silver pomander, worn at the waist, filled with herbs and resins, was a whisper of both piety and prestige. Perfume was not always worn openly. In some cases it was dabbed onto the inner seams of sleeves, or the ribbon of a garter, or the lining of a fan. Its message was reserved for those closest, those who would notice, those who would remember. And so, in the stillness of the dressing chamber, scent became memory, powder became touch. A noble woman stepped out into her world not only dressed but composed, not only adorned but encoded. Now, let us return to that hushed chamber, still heavy with the scent of lavender and myrrh. The glow of daylight faded into the warm flicker of candlelight. The noblewoman sits at her writing desk, a small piece of furniture tucked against the wall just beyond the reach of her dressing mirror. The surface is clean but well used, its wood scratched softly by the steady motion of quill and ink. Here, in this quieter corner of the day, she prepares not with fabric or fragrance, but with words. Writing for a noble woman of the Renaissance was an act at once private and performative. Letters were not casual, they were composed with care, each one an artifact of intention, and when it came to matters of the heart, to longing, flirtation, or quiet rebellion, these letters became more than correspondence. They became extensions of the self. Imagine her now, her hands steady. One dips the nib of the quill into a small glass vial, while the other steadies the page. The parchment is fine, but not ostentatious, just thick enough to hold ink without bleeding. A letter begins not with a greeting, but with breath. The act of composing these words, knowing they may be read again and again, folded into a lover's sleeve, or hidden inside a bound book, requires reflection. The language of love in the Renaissance was both flowery and coded. Directness was rare. Instead, affection was filtered through metaphor, classical allusion, and gentle restraint. A noble woman might reference the Greek gods, or weave verses from Petrarch into the curve of her lines. She might praise the color of one's cloak, not their eyes. She might mention the beauty of the garden, not the embrace they once shared there. This was not evasion, it was artistry. For those fortunate enough to be educated, poetry became a second tongue. Sonnets and stanzas replaced ordinary declarations. To speak plainly was to risk censure, but to write, your words strike like Cupid's errant arrow, or, in your presence my thoughts wander as Odysseus from his course, was to evoke without offending. It was a game, but one played with real stakes. These letters were rarely written once. Many noble women kept practice sheets, scratched full of beginnings and endings, revisions and refrains. Ink was precious, and yet dozens of drafts might be sacrificed before the final copy was made, and then, delicately, folded, never sealed too tightly in case it needed to be read quickly and burned just as fast. But it was not just letters that passed between lovers. Tokens, too, carried deep meaning. Small items, a ribbon, a handkerchief, a pressed violet, a pearl, were offered as signs, each one chosen carefully, not for its value, but for its intimacy. A handkerchief, embroidered with initials, might be handed off during a dance, slipped into a glove left behind. A miniature painted on ivory could be tucked beneath a bodice, worn close to the skin. A lock of hair, tied with silk thread, might rest inside a carved wooden box on a bedside table, seen only by moonlight. And there were more secretive offerings. A petal kissed with perfume, sealed between the pages of a prayer book. A poem cut into strips and hidden in a hollow bead. Even a single button pulled from a tunic during a moment of closeness became a sacred object. These were not grand gestures. They were whispers made solid, and they often spoke louder than any spoken vow. Of course, such exchanges were not without risk. Servants might intercept them. Brothers, fathers, or suspicious husbands might read too far between the lines. That is why so many of these letters and tokens were delivered with the help of intermediaries, trusted maids, sympathetic confessors, or clever apothecaries who offered not only ointments, but discretion. The noblewoman learned to navigate this world with quiet mastery. She knew when to write and when to remain silent, when to offer a token and when to withhold it, when to seal a note with wax, and when to fold it loosely so that it could be opened and resealed without notice. Some women went further. They learned to write in cipher, simple codes of letters rearranged or symbols swapped for vowels. Others used invisible ink made from lemon juice or milk, revealed only by heat. These techniques, borrowed from politics and espionage, found their way into the realm of romance, because where passion met danger, ingenuity always followed. And so, in the soft stillness of her chamber, the noblewoman read and reread her letter. She might hold it to her lips or press it briefly to her cheek. Then, with a practiced hand, she folded the page, not once, but twice, and tucked it into a small pouch sewn into the lining of her gown. Tomorrow, she would pass it on. Or perhaps tonight, beneath the cloak of darkness. These were not just missives. They were maps of emotion, drawn carefully, line by line. Let us return one final time to the quiet sanctum of the Renaissance noblewoman. Evening has fully arrived. The soft golden glow of the candles is now the only light, their flames mirrored gently in polished mirrors and silver trays. The air is warm, thick with the mingling fragrances of rose oil, beeswax, and the faintest trace of clove from a charm tucked into a nearby drawer. This is a moment of stillness and yet of intention. The noblewoman stands at her dressing table, not out of vanity, but as a final act of preparation for an encounter, a performance, or perhaps a simple moment of possibility. It is here, before the mirror, that the last, most delicate rituals unfold. She begins with her hair, drawing a finely crafted comb, perhaps ivory, perhaps mother of pearl, slowly through dark strands. Each motion is deliberate, unhurried. There is no rush. This act, repeated night after night, is not only for presentation, it is meditative, sacred in its routine. The Renaissance mind did not always separate beauty from health or health from spirit. The care of one's appearance was as much about balance and energy as it was about fashion. Then come the cosmetics, not the bold paints of later centuries, but something gentler, a tincture of crushed berries dabbed lightly at the lips, a fine dust of rice powder across the face to soften the skin and conceal the stress of sleeplessness or longing, a hint of ash from burnt rosemary smudged at the brows for definition. These were subtle enhancements, whispers, not proclamations. She may reach for a small vial of perfume, perhaps made with distilled roses, spikenard, or sweet marjoram. These scents were chosen with great care, for in the Renaissance, fragrance was understood to influence the spirit. A calming scent might soothe anxiety, a warming one could stir desire. Perfume was not merely decorative, it was part of the noble woman's emotional vocabulary. And there were charms. Tucked away in drawers or sewn into the hems of garments, these tiny objects carried meanings both personal and mystical. A silver coin with a hole drilled through the center, worn for luck. A piece of coral to ward off ill intentions. A pressed flower from a secret admirer, folded between pages of a prayer book. Each item had its story, each a quiet source of strength. Among the most curious objects were the talismans, tiny sachets filled with herbs, threads, and words written on parchment, a bit of fennel for protection, a twist of red silk for passion, a Latin phrase scrawled in minuscule script said to ensure faithfulness or draw the attention of a beloved. These items were not shown, not spoken of openly, but they were held close, beneath the bodice, inside a shoe, or hidden in the lining of a cloak. Superstitions abounded. One might never place a mirror facing the bed for fear of inviting spirits. A hairpin dropped on the floor foretold a broken promise. A sudden gust of wind during dressing was seen as a warning, a sign that an appointment should be delayed, or at least approached with caution. All these rituals, the brushing of hair, the choice of perfume, the folding of letters, the hiding of charms, were woven together into a single act of preparation. And while they might seem modest, or even quaint, they were rich with significance. In a world where women's choices were often constrained, these small rituals were a quiet assertion of control, a way to influence fate, even if only in one's own heart. Dressing in this sense was not just adornment, it was creation, the creation of mood, of intent, of narrative. Who she would be tonight, the distant lady, the playful muse, the silent observer, could be shaped, at least in part, by what she wore and carried. And yet, for all the layers of lace and silk, all the fragrant oils and silver-threaded charms, there remained always a core of uncertainty. Would the message be received? Would the glance be returned? Would the spell, literal or figurative, hold? That is the nature of longing, of romance. It is never certain. And so each ritual, each detail became a kind of comfort, a way to feel prepared, even when the outcome was unknowable. Now, as the final candle is snuffed and the chamber falls into hush, the noble woman steps away from her mirror, her heart steady, her steps soft. Whatever the evening brings, she will carry with her the quiet confidence of preparation, the soft armor of scent and silk and secret hope. In these small rituals performed night after night, we find not only the performance of love, but the preservation of self. Let us now close the chapter and move gently into our conclusion, where we reflect on the strange, tender world we have visited, the secret life of Renaissance romance. And so, dear listener, our journey through the soft shadows of Renaissance love draws to a close. We began in the twilight corridors of Italian townhouses, where whispered hopes lingered in the folds of velvet and the corners of candle-lit rooms. We drifted through apothecaries and black market stalls where the line between healer and charlatan blurred, and love could be measured in pinches of powder and drops of amber-colored oils. We followed Lucrezia Borgia through the tangle of passion and politics, her story a delicate embroidery of rumor, power, and sorrow. We traced the margins of forgotten manuscripts, inked with quiet yearning and passed hand to hand like sacred talismans, and finally we stood beside the noblewoman's mirror, watching as she crafted herself not only in silk and scent, but in intention and imagination. What ties all these chapters together is not just love, but the effort of love, the rituals, the preparation, the courage to reach beyond one's grasp. In the Renaissance, love was not merely a feeling, it was a craft, a study, a discipline. And while many of the practices we've explored, the herbs, the scrolls, the charms, may seem distant or strange now, the heart that guided them is familiar, the desire to be seen, to be wanted, to connect, to leave an impression in another soul. The people of the Renaissance lived in a world thick with rules, of class, of conduct, of belief. Yet beneath those rigid frameworks, they found ways to reach for each other. They invented rituals where they had no rights. They practiced tenderness in secret. They carved spaces of magic into the ordinary rhythms of dressing, writing, brewing, waiting. And in doing so, they remind us of a simple, enduring truth, that even in the most structured of societies, the human heart will find its corners of rebellion, quiet, fragrant, fragile as a dried petal tucked into a letter. As you lie now, still and safe, perhaps you find yourself lingering in those long-ago rooms. Perhaps you imagine the creak of floorboards, the hush of silk being drawn through a ring, the sharp, sweet scent of clove and cinnamon. Let those echoes lull you. Let them remind you that history is not just kings and battles and treaties. It is gestures, glances, perfumes on the air. It is the handwritten line folded into a bodice, the drop of oil behind the ear, the breath held at the turn of a key. It is the countless, unrecorded ways people have reached for each other in the dark. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you enjoyed this gentle walk through the past, we invite you, quietly, when you're ready, to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more soft, winding journeys through forgotten history. Until next time, sleep well.